Welcome to the Colorado Department of Education webinar, Gifted Identification Assessment Practices and the Multiple Pathways to Identification. The intent of this webinar is to create a common understanding of gifted identification as it pertains to Colorado statute defined in the Exceptional Children Education Act, otherwise known as ECEA. The goal of the webinar is a facilitation of professional learning. Therefore, the webinar is intended to be led by the Administrative Unit, otherwise known as AU, Gifted Coordinator or Director, who will facilitate the discussions throughout this presentation. If it is not possible for the webinar to be facilitated by the AU Coordinator or Director, and you are individually viewing this webinar, then it is strongly encouraged upon the completion of the webinar, you review your identification determinations and any questions you may have with your AU Gifted Education Lead to ensure there is consistency in identification practices by educators throughout Colorado. Before you proceed with the webinar, it is also important to download the accompanying documents necessary for this presentation. You may wish to print them or be able to access them on your computer. Here is a complete list of the documents you will need and the order in which they will be reviewed during this webinar. To complete the webinar will take approximately 3.5 to 4 hours. This includes time where you will pause the webinar and conduct team discussions. Part 1 will take approximately 1 to 1.5 hours and will review gifted terminology as it pertains to identification. Part 2 will require about half an hour to review the areas of gifted identification. Part 3 may be subdivided into 4 parts. There will be 4 student identification scenarios, and each scenario will take approximately a half an hour. The content of the webinar will include a review of Colorado guidelines for gifted identification. A comprehensive examination of these guidelines can be found in the identification chapter that you are encouraged to download and review upon the conclusion of this webinar. Additionally, the presentation will identify areas that are the choice of the AU in terms of identification decisions that support the demographics and culture of the administrative unit. Anytime you see a large blue C, this indicates an area where the AU has a choice in identification assessment practices. Our former identification practices were first established in 2007 with the passing of House Bill 7-1244. The creation of gifted education rules outlined in the Exceptional Children Education Act followed this legislation. The passing of House Bill 141102 required a revision to the original ECEA rules. The rule revision has created an opportunity for Colorado to review current identification practices to ensure they align to statute. What has been added with rule revision include the following elements, which will be discussed in greater detail throughout this presentation. But briefly, these include seeking identification referrals from a variety of sources, a timeline of 30 days after receiving that referral for the team to make a decision on next steps, and that to be communicated to all stakeholders, including the parent, student, and educators. That AUs have assessments to ensure the identification of traditionally underrepresented population, and that identification is a review team procedure. A determination letter upon the conclusion of the identification process should be sent to the parents and placed in the student's cumulative record folder. Not meeting criteria on one assessment shall not limit identification. ECEA rules state the guidelines for identifying students for a talent pool and the idea of portability in gifted identification. Again, the purpose of this webinar is for us to explore the various pathways that might lead to gifted identification. We will review important information to help us build a bridge of common understanding throughout the state so that from one end of Colorado to the other end of Colorado, gifted identification follows a set of standard guidelines aligned to gifted education rules. However, at the same time, providing a level of autonomy to AUs and districts in creating an identification framework that best meets the needs of their unique students. The outcomes of this webinar include building a common understanding of the gifted identification process, to understand that there will be multiple pathways that might lead to identification. You will practice using identification guidelines and complete several student scenarios, and then have the ability to collaborate with team members to initiate your next steps in your identification practices. As we proceed through this presentation, it is important that we stay focused on the needs of our gifted students in Colorado. This means we may need to expand our thinking in perhaps some different ways than we have before when it comes to gifted identification. As stated, this presentation examines the different pathways that lead to gifted identification. As a state, we will come together to ensure there is a common understanding of the intent of the law, to ensure students from underrepresented populations are not denied equal access, and that the needs of students pave the path to appropriate and equitable identification procedures in all our AUs and districts. This photograph is possibly symbolic of our work. The pathway to identification may be paved in different colors of pencil, for example. This is similar to how a variety of instruments are used during the identification process. And that pathway may not always be straight for some students. It may be bent or have numerous contours. You see, each student will have their own unique pathway to identification. But at the end, there will come a point when identification practices must be consistent in Colorado to ensure a student's identification is honored in any school district throughout our state. Again, it will be the choice of the administrative unit to determine these assessment practices.